Welcome to another edition of the Last Negroes at Harvard podcast. I'm Kent Garrett. There were 18 of us in the Harvard College class of 1963. We are all over 83 years old now, and for the last 5 years we have produced a weekly podcast. Our guest this week is Brandon Terry. He is the John L. Loeb Associate Professor of the Social Sciences at Harvard University. His latest book is titled Shattered Dreams, Infinite Hope, a tragic vision of the civil rights movement. I'm joined by 25 of my Harvard classmates.
Okay. Originally from East Orange, New Jersey, class of 63, like almost everyone here. Now living in Newton, Mass. And I've been in film and video, TV all my life, and still volunteering, making videos for climate and democracy.
Okay, John Woodford.
Here in Ann Arbor, Michigan, grew up in Benton Harbor, Michigan, across the state, and I've been in printing and publishing through here and there throughout my life, from New York to Chicago to here.
Okay, Richard.
Richard Rothstein, same class, of course. Born in New York, now in grandchildren town, Berkeley, California, but mostly on Cape Cod. A writer, journalist, of various kinds.
David Lilleval.
I'm also 63. I'm in New York City. I'm from New York City. And I have a new grandchild all the way out in Brooklyn.
Wow.
I'm a historian of India.
Oh, okay. Great. Alden.
Born in Mass General, grew up in northwestern Connecticut, lived around the country in various places, now live outside of San Francisco, and my wife and I have a fundraising consulting firm. And I'm glad to see, Kent, that you brought somebody in who brings a little class to this group. The rest of us are kind of dressed like we're ready to go to bed or something.
Used to be we couldn't eat in the house dining room without a tie.
Exactly.
Right. Nick.
I'm Nick Bancroft, live in Medfield, Massachusetts, outside of Boston, Peace Corps after graduating from Harvard, and then finance. I think probably I was a bunk mate with Alden Briscoe in the MGH when we might have arrived around the same time.
Okay, all right. Bill.
Yeah, Bill Collins, we mentioned already. Harvard 63, grew up in the Boston area. After the 20 years in the Navy, went to Westinghouse in Pittsburgh and then the Savannah River site near Aiken. Just stayed in Aiken for the past 35 years. And here I am.
Okay, David Allen.
Here in Concord, Massachusetts, unfortunately, in addition to the buzz cut you now know about for the neurosurgery, I'm a cripple. I managed to fall down, I think, a little bit. And impact this non-invasive brain surgery, but so his right hand is now steady when this one's all over the place. A life across a whole bunch of places, but dedicated to seeing if we can't keep their democracy. And my other half is supposed to be on here. She's probably trying to get at it with her computer because she's reading your book right now.
Oh, okay, that's great. Roger.
Hi, Brandon. Hi, everybody. I am Roger Phillimore from Kinvara Island, observing from this side of the big pond, and family historian with ancestry in in America, Britain, and Ireland.
Okay, David Othmer.
Born in Boston, but grew up in Central and South America. After college or after business school, I went to Colombia and worked there for 2 years, and in Medellin, not doing drugs. I came back to this country and been working in public broadcasting most of my life.
Okay, George Jones.
George Jones, class of 63, currently living in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and I am a retired biochemist / molecular biologist.
Okay, Susan, are you on?
It was.
I think she.
Here she
There
comes.
she is. Susan, introduce yourself to Brandon.
Oops, sorry. I gotta leave. Oops.
Okay, let's go to Connie.
Yes.
Reese?
Oh, she's starting maybe. I don't know.
I think she has a
Hi.
Yeah, the call.
I think she has a phone call.
Oh, okay. Yes, class of 63, like everyone else, but at Radcliffe. And Harvard Law School, 66. I started out doing legal services for the poor, then went to the corporate legal world. I'm now retired and I have a house upstate, and I'm an avid gardener. And I have other hobbies that keep me going too, like knitting and music.
Beautiful.
Okay. All right. Well, Brandon, welcome. Thank you so much for coming on, and tell us about your life and about the book.
Well, first of all, let me just say thank you, Kent, for inviting me, and thank everybody for coming. I mean, you all, even a little bit I just got about your stories. I know you're all extraordinary people with many things to do. So the fact that you would spend some time with me in the book means a lot. And I'm a big fan of Kent's book. He had me at the title, and
Yeah, it's a good title.
it's a great title. And you'll all be heartened to know that I just finished last week teaching a seminar on Dr. King and Malcolm X and their political philosophies. And one of the things we did with the class is that we went down to the archives and pulled some of the ephemera and Crimson articles from their visits to campus, which overlapped with the time you all were there. So when Malcolm came to the Leverett House Forum, we got them to see those documents, even the little slip of paper where Archie Epps and everybody's trying to figure out how much to pay him. And it was just a remarkable time. So, as much as I'm happy to share about the book, I'd love to hear your recollections of that time as well. It would mean a lot to me. So thank you, Kent, and thank you, everybody. I am from Baltimore originally. I was born in Baltimore, grew up in a little area right on the edge called Randallstown. My family is like a lot of families of that era and places like Baltimore. Skip, Henry Louis Gates often talks about the kind of post-civil rights era as a story of two Black Americas coming apart at the seams. And my family story is a lot like that. On one side, you have my mother, who is extraordinary educator, taught over 40 years in Baltimore City Public Schools, was 1977 Baltimore City Teacher of the Year. She protected me from an extraordinary amount of bad influences and poured and poured and poured into me. And my father, who did much of the same, he had to overcome a very different set of circumstances. He was incarcerated in federal prison right before I was born. And my older brother spent much of my childhood incarcerated. We had a family who dealt with, on the one hand, these extraordinary new opportunities opening up to people. My mother was one of the first people to integrate Baltimore City public schools. On the other hand, we were dealing with drug addiction, incarceration, violence. Many of my family members lost their lives at a early age. And so I say all of that not just to locate where I'm from, but to dramatize two things. One is that my journey to Harvard was pretty improbable. I literally applied on a bet from my uncle. I got a little letter in the mail saying, you should apply. And I showed it to him thinking that we would both have a great laugh at the very idea of me being there. And thankfully, he didn't think it was funny at all. He thought it was one of my worst jokes and said, listen, you're complaining about how much it costs to apply and you're trying to find ways to get out of it. I'll bet you the application fee and I'll double it if you get in.
Oh,
And that's the only reason I'm here. His bet and the work of a man some of you may know, if not from overlap, maybe by reputation, of a man named William Adler, who ran Harvard admissions in Maryland. My first interview at Harvard, when you apply, I went down to see a doctor at Johns Hopkins, who was my interviewer, excuse me. And he talked to me about how he played hockey and how he would get drunk every weekend. And at the time, I had never been drunk and had never played hockey. So it was a great example of one of these moments where like the cultural literacy and cultural estrangement dramatically affected the outcome because he wrote to the Maryland admissions team that I was not a suitable candidate for Harvard, that I would not do well there, and that they should deny me admissions. And thankfully, Bill Adler, whose picture I keep in my office along with my uncle, pulled my name out of the file and said, no, 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 we're going to take a different look at this guy. This doesn't match what else we have. And so he brought me down and changed my life. So those guys are how I ended up here. And the other reason I tell this long introduction is because sitting at the intersection of the class divide in Black America, I think left me pretty well positioned to see the romantic story of the civil rights movement falling apart before my eyes. There's a way in which what I've come to think of as the romantic narrative of the civil rights movement as a story of unified triumph, of good over evil, of a more perfect union coming into being, of undoubtedly heroic sacrifices being made to deliver America finally from the scourge of deep, deep, deep racial inequity, and deep hopelessness. That didn't map the things that were in front of my face every day. We were forced to see those people who had been left behind, and who were the inconvenient reminders of the incompleteness of that narrative. And so that has always been in the back of my mind. And as I moved through the academy, I've had extraordinary mentors: Henry Louis Gates, Cornel West, Michael Dawson, Tommy Shelby, G.A. Cohen, Shayla Ben-Habib. So I moved through the academy. I drifted more and more toward questions of philosophy. And part of the reason is that in college, I was a big activist type. So I read a lot of Black political thought. I read a lot of civil rights movement stuff, and I was a very activist type. And I was struck by a kind of existential experience toward the end of my undergraduate career, where I realized that I've now become fond of using Hannah Arendt's words to describe it, but I was using action as an excuse for not thinking. And that I was doing things but didn't really understand what the principles were, what was grounding my judgment, what was motivating my judgment. And I just felt disoriented. And so I turned to philosophy to try to make sense of those things. Like, what are my commitments? What do I really think? And much of my approach to philosophy is just figuring out puzzles for myself that I think other people share. And so this book grows out of those life experiences and a sense of a great, great puzzle for our culture, which is, how is it that we have all come to know a certain story of the civil rights movement, one that historians have long insisted is inadequate in its periodization, in its geographic scope, in its cast of characters, in its account of the political ideas motivating its central actors. How is it that that story has managed to ride roughshod over all of that critique to become something so familiar and so seemingly ready at hand that it becomes basically exemplary in the political culture of the present and in the philosophical life of the present? That people reach for it when they want to talk about citizenship, when they want to talk about hope, when they want to talk about equality, when they want to talk about justice, when they want to talk about protest. That the judgments that they think are condensed in those stories manage to orient us toward judgments of politics in the present. How did it come to be that way? Number one, what are the consequences of that kind of storytelling? And what happens when that story, which has been authoritative for so long, starts to collapse? Which I think has happened in the course of me writing this book and is accelerating at speeds that I could not have anticipated. Just this week, the Trump administration suggested that Martin Luther King Day would no longer be a special day for the National Park Service, right? Where free admission to the parks, right? There are all these small things about symbolic references to the civil rights movement and larger things about the civil rights jurisprudence that are under assault.
Didn't he suggest that it be his birthday?
I didn't see that, but it wouldn't surprise me.
That's what I.
Yeah,
That's what
it wouldn't surprise me. So those are the big animating questions behind the book. Uh, the book takes a long detour into philosophy to ask really hard questions. What does it mean to be exemplary? What does it mean to operate as an example, a historical example, when people are making political judgments? What does it mean to make a political judgment? And can it be done absent an authoritative set of categories and narrative boundaries, which we've grown used to? And it asks hard questions about the nature of historical discourse and historical representation. I am in the camp of people who think that history is essentially narrative, and that if we take narrative form seriously, it requires us to ask hard questions about the genre of historical narratives, and that literary forms are not as distinctive from historical discourse as many of us like to think. That part of what makes history grab us and seem complete and seem meaningful is that people are deploying certain stylistic maneuvers, certain forms of emplotment, certain tropes and strategies that are constitutive of genres and other ways of representing the world from literature. So what do we have in the civil rights movement? We have a romantic story that's about unity in the process of becoming, the triumph of good over evil, about an essential reconciliation to a deep consensus underlying American civilization and perhaps even the modern world. And that story, as it started to break down, and we can talk more about why I think it's broken down, has been met with an ironic rejoinder. The ironist who looks at that and says, well, what about the ghetto poor who've been left behind? What about the queer people who've been marginalized? What about the Black women whose ideas and demands were not lifted up? What about the ways that racial inequality is still so intractable in the present? How can we talk about progress? They say that the civil rights movement is a non-event. And if you look at these axes of change, it hasn't changed fundamentally anything. And these people have grown in great esteem in the academy. They're called Afro-pessimists, and they deploy an ironic history where they play with chronology, where they'll talk about the integration of schools only to hit you on the other end with the statistics that show that schools are more segregated now than they were in the 1960s. And so I say, looking at that failure of romance, the failure of and the challenge of pessimism, is there another way we can tell this story? And for me, tragedy is the antidote. And so I come from a long line of philosophers who think that tragedy is a way of responding to pessimism. It doesn't just mean awful. It doesn't just mean sad. It's a way of responding to pessimism by being able to look at conflict as a permanent part of our condition, being able to linger over defeat and use defeat as a way of, as a space of reflection and judgment to open up new possibilities, being serious about contingency, knowing that certain things can only happen at certain moments, and trying to train our judgment to see those contingencies in the present. And above all, having a sense of tragic responsibility, knowing that we must act without guarantees. We may not be sure that the moral arc of the universe bends toward justice. We may be the agents of injustice ourselves, but we have to act without guarantees to prevent things from being worse and to try to bring about good in the world. And it's just incumbent upon us to track the wrongs that we might contribute to and repair them with the right kind of historical memory and historical consciousness. And when history is written in that mode, like Du Bois's Black Reconstruction or some of the texts of the long civil rights movement, I think we're edified in an extraordinary way, a way that steels us for the long siege and the long struggle against racial injustice.
Mm. Wow.
Wow.
Okay.
Wow.
Wow.
John Woodford, you want to go first or what? Oh, no, I see David. David Millabell has his hand up. Go ahead.
Well, I'm sorry I haven't read your book yet, and I certainly will. It strikes me that you're still constructing a single narrative. It's a tragic narrative, but it's a single narrative. And one of the things that maybe we could think about is multiple narratives happening at the same time. And the perspective that we have as class of 63 and that Kent wrote about so wonderfully in his book is an earlier perspective in time and the different points of view that may happen, and also the geography of it, so that one is concentrating on the United States as a unit, and at the same time many other things are happening in the world. So
Yes.
there's, you may know, a German historical theorist, Reinhard Koselleck, who talks about multiple chronologies and multiple geographies. And that makes it all the more complicated. But it is like a novel with cross currents and counterpoints and so on. And having said that, everything becomes much more complicated. It's harder to come then to a final climax of tragedy or something like that. It keeps things up in the air, and that's the challenge of writing about history. And one can do it in small bits, in anecdotes or concentrating on a particular place. But it's very hard to construct a large, full story master narrative, if you like, that can say it all, because there is no whole there. There are too many cross currents.
No, I take your point really well, and I think one of the ways I approach this, so there's like kind of two things going on at the same time. So one is the analytic, right? Which, the whole book is premised on the fact that there are these competing narratives. That people are going to tell these stories in different ways, and that we need to do the work of kind of hermeneutical reconstruction. So by that, I just mean understanding exactly what you point out, which is that history is always going to be revised and rethematized and re-narrated based on what's happening in the present and based on what kind of imagined future seem possible. So the stories that are going to be told of the civil rights movement in the first draft, right? The kind of stuff Howard Zinn would have written in Southern Mystique, or Diary of a Sit-In, right? Stuff that came right out immediately is going to look differently than stuff that came out in 84, which is going to look different than stuff that came out in 95. It's going to look different than the things I write. So the pivotal chapter, I think, in some ways, is the chapter called The Tangible Ruins of Our Present, which is about what I call the crisis of authority in Black political life. So I actually try to give an account inspired by the work of a lot of literary critics who they ask this question, which I am sort of fascinated by. It's like, why do certain genres fall out of favor at certain times, right? Why does the romance novel have a certain purchase in a period and it falls out? And this is obviously a question people will constantly ask about tragedy. Is it possible to write tragedy anymore? Has tragedy disappeared from art? What would it mean for it to disappear from art? This is Nietzsche's question even. And so for me, it's about getting that story right. So I think it's not even enough to just say, so I would even go further than I think you're going to say, look, it's not even just different narratives. It's trying to understand what makes narratives more or less powerful in a given moment. And one of the things I think has been really hard for romance is not just the intractability of certain forms of racial inequality and the resurgence of movements that no longer even pay the tribute that hypocritical vice must pay to virtue, right? They don't even pretend to lionize Dr. King or lionize the civil rights movement or lionize civil rights jurisprudence or the principle of colorblindness. So those things are certainly at odds with the romantic story, but we've got these other things that are underlying, right? That you have the collapse of the idea of racial realism, the notion that if we could just identify the right foundation for Black politics, we could describe the shared interest that all Black people have. That idea, I think, has fallen into crisis. The idea that the Black church is going to necessarily be the vanguard institution. As you saw in the Black Lives Matter movement, that idea, while some people still endorse it, was met with dramatic hostility by many movement activists and many leading commentators. The notion of a certain imagined future being integrationism or Black nationalism, those concepts have been so underdeveloped and weakened that I always like to tell the example of when Kamala Harris and Joe Biden got into the debate about busing, right? And everyone's like, oh, Kamala Harris has scored this great point on Biden about busing. And then the first question, the follow-up was like, well, Kamala Harris, are you going to bring back busing? Do you have a vision of integration? She was like, of course not. Right. What would it mean to say I'm an integrationist at this moment? It's not a well fleshed out philosophy anymore in a way that it once was. And then certain ideas about the cultural politics of representation, the idea that there are Black artists who can represent the group collectively or defend a positive image of the group versus a negative image. Those coordinates have been scrambled, especially in the wake of hip hop. So I say all that to say that those stories that are about unity, that are about the good overcoming evil, that are about triumphalism, part of the reason they don't intuitively seem plausible to people anymore is that whole cultural underpinning that's happened in that gap between your class and mine has started to erode those pillars of authority and change how that past is interpreted. So I'm in total agreement with you about multiple narratives as an analytical matter. I still think it doesn't absolve us of the practice of judgment between them when we're trying to orient ourselves in the world and understand the political phenomena that present themselves to us in light of that past.
Connie.
I guess I'm a civil rights optimist. I think that the civil rights movement made the most tremendous effect on the US and on the world. I think it inspired the gay movement. I think it inspired women's movement, and the world will never be the same. Now, I agree with you that it didn't solve racism. I mean, that's pretty obvious. But it did a tremendous amount. Now,
Absolutely.
your ideas are absolutely fascinating to me. And it seems to me that I've read that like the NAACP represented really only privileged Blacks. That was their focus, for the privileged Black person to be able to penetrate the greater society. And they did that. The the problem of the unprivileged or the poorer elements of Black society, well, they fall into the American pit. America's never done anything for poor people in general. I mean, there's like a class problem and there's a specifically racist problem. And the class problem was not addressed. However, I think at the end of his career, Martin Luther King was starting on the poor people's movement because I think he understood that there was just a whole other aspect of this problem that needed to be addressed. And that's the one that really is intractable. Well, racism is intractable too, but less. Think in terms of like when I was younger, no Blacks were in movies, no Blacks were in newspapers.
Yes.
You didn't get any Black interpretation of current events. I mean, it's like a tremendous change. The other thing is that I think it's perfectly natural for a unified vision of Black people to fall apart because there was a time, like in my parents' day, when they were absolutely involved with other Black people because they had no choice.
Right.
They were all treated the same. Now you have some Black people who are the head of major fancy corporations, some who are sitting on the Supreme Court.
Right.
And the interests and the movement varies. But in many ways, that's probably good. Look at white people.
Absolutely.
They're not unified.
Right. Right.
So why should we be unified?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So, but your ideas are absolutely fascinating and ones that intrigue me a lot.
No, thank you so much. And I'll be really brief because I think your remarks are powerful. So part of what I'm trying to do in the book, I think, is respond, and you may have had this frustration with people where you have this view of the civil rights movement, which I think is accurate. And I start out by saying it is so rare in human history to have an event around which such extraordinary philosophical and political energy coalesces, right? That everybody has it ready at hand to call upon, to remember. When we ask people who are their most admired Americans, people from the civil rights movement. When we ask people to name the greatest Americans, they name people from the civil rights movement. When we ask people, even in other parts of the world, to say, why should we have any hope that we can change society? Why should we, how should we protest? What do they reach for? They reach for the civil rights movement. So it is just true that this movement has had this mark on the world. So I start from that premise. It's like, what does that mean? Like, what does it really mean philosophically when we are all using that as an example for thinking? Right, for thinking about what makes a good protest, what makes somebody a citizen, right? What are the aesthetic questions it raises? What are the ethical questions? What are the epistemological, political questions? So I think that's exactly where I'm starting. And I'm trying to respond, I think, to a tendency which you may have been frustrated by, and I'm sure you've encountered, where you have often many younger people saying, well, the movement didn't change anything.
Yeah, exactly.
And you start telling, well, look, you say all the things you just said, and those things are indisputably true. And they're trying to convey something else. And so I want to say, what is a vocabulary that gets past that impasse, that acknowledges the sense of tragedy, defeat, turmoil, disorientation that they're trying to speak to, while not losing grip on the significance of the partial victory, without washing it away in a flood of ironism and pessimism. And I think that the philosophical, the literary tradition of tragedy helps you do that. After all, there's no defeat. No defeat is tragic if it's meaningless, right? It's only tragic if something extraordinary is at stake. If something extraordinary is being wrestled with and grappled over and striven for. That's what I'm trying to recover with this language. Um, and I hope that by the end of the book, people walk away not only with a new appreciation of the scale of the civil rights movement's partial victories, but also, I think, and this is the last undercurrent of your remarks, a sense of the extraordinarily generative possibilities of its splendid failures, right? So that we don't see the Poor People's Campaign as something other than the civil rights movement, right? That it grows organically out of the internal concerns of the movement, that the NAACP isn't caricatured as just an elite middle class operation. There were actually really serious debates within the NAACP about whether you could use the 13th Amendment's jurisprudence around forced labor to make economic conditions better for the poor. Now that gets defeated as a jurisprudential strategy, but it happened. That's a splendid failure. How can that change the way we think about constitutional law in the present, about a politics of egalitarianism in the present? The civil rights movement is something we can return to with that kind of imagination enlarging possibility instead of experiencing it as a flattening or a burden, the way that many young activists, I think, narrate it because they can't see all of the pieces and complications that unfurl within its long arc.
Bill.
Yeah, a couple of, first of all, a general comment. I'm fascinated by what you've been saying, and I definitely want to read the book. I can understand, I think, where you're coming from in this idea of tragedy. But we obviously have a long way to go. There's no question about that. The present administration makes that very clear. And I think to a large extent, the present administration came about in a reaction to Barack Obama's presidency.
I think that's
I think
true.
enough people came out, were horrified by a black man being president to vote for Donald Trump. Now we can talk about Donald Trump in many respects, but I have a couple of anecdotes. I'm sitting here in this shopping mall in Myrtle Beach, and I just happened to be walking along the sidewalk a few minutes ago, and here was a young couple. I don't know, they're in their 20s, I guess, I don't know. A black man and a blonde, blue-eyed woman walking arm in arm, and nobody batting an eye about that. But I was saying, 50 years ago,
Yeah, right.
how would that have been? I
Right.
hesitate to say.
Right.
And the other thing I'll mention, my wife is a member of the First Baptist Church in Aiken, and the First Baptist Church in Aiken is an all white congregation, right?
Of course.
And there's the Second Baptist Church is
Yep.
all black.
Every
And the
town.
First Baptist Church and the Second Baptist Church are making a determined effort to get together and talk about remedying or dealing with the sins of racism as a conscious topic. So there's progress. There really is. And I just want to leave you with that. And I'm sure.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think, again, one of the contributions of the book, I hope, is finding a way for people to talk about progress along certain axes, and in fragmentary ways without feeling compelled to tell a whole unifying, universal story that doesn't keep track of those places where things are not moving as well, or present us with new challenges. And I write at great length about Obama in the book. Toward the end, I talk a little bit about the Trump phenomena. I didn't really want to address it head on here. But to me, the great challenge of the Trump movement, in part, is that they've harnessed a really deep wave of resentment to a more immediate tendency in American political life, the Black Lives Matter era, the so-called woke era. They've harnessed a great wave of resentment to that to unravel even some of the things we thought were permanent victories of the civil rights movement. And again, tragedy is about fragility. It's about the idea that there is no final victory, that these things can always be reopened, that the resentments and conflicts that they represent are never completely resolved. And So I'm looking for a way of thinking about history that prepares us for that moment instead of leaving us to be surprised that this movement is upon us, and a movement that really does threaten to unravel so many of the extraordinary things that you saw uh, turned into law and statute in your lifetime.
Okay,
I
John.
must say, I don't find the notion of tragedy in looking at these events. I don't find it helpful. I don't find it accurate, really. I find it a projection. I think it's a projection, it's your projection, but tragedy is connected with unhappy endings, distress, and it is a notion of a finality. How can someone looking at the arc of history and, the ups and downs, the dynamic situation, um, come to an event and then freeze frame it at a moment when there are losses and say that this is the essence: defeat, distress, unhappy endings, etc., that this is the philosophical, this is the worldview, this is the way things are. I think that that's a big mistake, because it's projecting from a certain moment in history and ignoring the fact that there have been ups and downs for not only our movement, but all sorts of movements in the world that we might say are progressive or democratic, whatever we want to call them, and they have ups and downs. So I would say a realistic, and looking at the dialectical nature of any kind of movement in the world, not just human movements, that's a more helpful way to look at it, because I know you make some nice critical comments about so-called Afro-pessimism, which is another vogue sort of a thing, and I agree with you there. But I don't find that the literary notion of tragedy, let's say, is much more nuanced than the lay people in public are likely to get into. You're into areas of, European and American way out kind of philosophy, of literary philosophy, and et cetera. But I just don't think that tragedy really captures the situation. And I think there are other writers looking at these events, like Touré Reed, Adolph Reed's son, in Toward Freedom.
Yep.
Look him in that book. Cedric Johnson in After Black Lives Matter. I find that people looking at it with these historical perspectives maybe are what we are needing now more than a literary project. That's my response.
Yeah. No, I appreciate it. And I think our disagreement revolves around three features. So the first is that I think it's a common understanding of tragedy, but I think ultimately a misguided one, to think of it as about final ending in the abstract. So I think there are two things happening at once. So tragedy revolves out of the theater. It evolves out of the theater, right? So what is it doing with the death, the defeat, the despair on stage in its earliest form? Well, it's showing that the possibilities for certain modes of action under certain descriptions can disappear because of the web of contradictions, as you would say, dialectical movements, constraints, contingencies that it's enmeshed in. It dramatizes the fragility of human action. There are writers, right? At the end of the day, history has to be mediated by discourse. It has to come to us as some form of storytelling, some form of writing, some form of representation. It has to be mediated by language. So we have to understand the language and what is being conveyed to us. There are authors who do not emphasize the fragility of human action, the way that certain possibilities for acting in certain ways disappear in the world. And there are writers who don't necessarily take seriously the notion that even disappointments and defeats can be intellectually generative. In fact, so in my home discipline, political science, The most historically oriented field is called American political development. And they will tell you, right, when you start out, they say, we are only interested in those forms of action, those forms of politics that have become part of the enduring pattern of authority in American life. So if you want to study the Black Panther Party, you should not study that because it didn't become part of the enduring pattern of authority in American life. And you say, well, what about their ideas? What about the ways that the authorities responded to them? What about the ways that their critiques might open up judgments to help us understand the nature of policing? You say, no, 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 no. They lost, so they are not valuable. Right? I think we have to embrace writers, historical representations that move in a different idiom. And for me, tragedy helps describe that disposition, that way of rendering history, which again must always be mediated by language. The second piece is that I think, I have lots of sympathies with Cedric. We are friendly. And we share, I think, what you're calling a dialectical sensibility. It's all over the book. And I simply think that that way of approaching things ultimately leads you to a kind of tragic vision. And here I follow people like Raymond Williams, Cornel West, uh, Terry Eagleton, who have come out of that kind of left tradition, but have found a language of tragedy helpful in terms of thinking about the political problems that still remain after analysis. One of which is, how do you steel people for long durée struggles, right? If they are, as Du Bois wrote about his early period, if he thinks everything's going to be destroyed in one giant rush of energy or one great explosive movement, and then people are going to be disappointed when that doesn't happen, how do you teach them about history in a different way? How do you prepare them to make sacrifices that they might not live to see the benefit of? Romance has a story about how it does that. But if you think romance has other problems, you need to solve that problem some other way. Those problems don't disappear with the right analytic. They still remain as political and philosophical existential problems. And I think tragedy, because of its origins in theater, is about edifying the audience of the story, really speaks to. I have more to say, but I'll leave it at those responses for now.
David Allen.
So you began, if I'm correct, you took us all the way back to leaving college and setting yourself the task of getting at the thinking, the words. I want to be careful exactly how I couch this, behind the action. And today you have come to tragedy as a way to, I think you're telling us, do exactly that. And that is not a small thing. Even for us old, I won't use the four-letter word here, but in our middle 80s, who really care about actions we might take. You gave us an example, actually, of tragedy as a means for doing precisely this, getting at the ideas behind action. Was it the 13th Amendment? I apologize. I do not know the history well enough, but you mentioned some case in which 13 was the key number, wherein there was a failure.
Yes.
An attempt to use but, and yet that failure was in effect educative of the bridge. It could point us to where we might go next. And if in fact we accept that history will forever, long after we're gone, be the struggle of up and down, and you only have to look back at a few thousand years of human history to know that that's very much the case, that we can't expect any sort of nirvana to come out of what we do. how crucial is it? Actually, I think, certainly in my view, it's exactly right to say that what we need is a way to characterize, among other things, these failures going forward. What I got myself to was I managed to capture two of the elements when you talk about tragedy. Two at the end. My fried brain here, and especially at this age, didn't get the first two. Would love to hear what the first two were again. The two I got were the contingency aspect, the responsibility, and in fact, uh, responsibility for our own, in effect, failures. I don't know whether it's useful to go back to those first two, but as you hear, I am so appreciative of your taking us to a modus that allows us to capture history in a way that might help us think about going forward, the activism we might have in the future.
No, thank you. Thank you. The first two pillars, I think, of a tragic vision. The first is about serious conflict. So, in opposition to something like the romantic view, romantic histories tend to think that there's a kind of underlying consensus or essential good that's often the real character of their story. So people become metaphors for that underlying consensus. So Obama put himself forward as a metaphor for an underlying American consensus. There is no Black America. There is no white America. There's only the United States of America. The tragedian sees deep-seated conflict as perpetual, that there's no way of transcending it finally for all time. And in fact, even if we were to agree on certain ideas of the good, we would still be in conflict because they probably wouldn't be able to all be realized at the same time in the same place, the way everyone wants. So there's always going to be deep-seated conflict and antagonism around power, around values. And to me, that's part of the tragic story, that conflict is there despite us being enmeshed within a kind of interdependent garment of destiny. The second thing is the significance of defeat part, which is you might not have caught it when you said, but you described it exactly. It's this notion that these defeats are places of judgment. They're not to be dismissed the way that the scholars I talk about in American political development or something like that might not want us to linger on them, that they actually are precisely the places of judgment where we might reopen what looks like a victory, what looks like a settled consensus, what looks like a triumph, what looks like finality, and inspire our own political judgment and action in the present. And I take real inspiration from Du Bois, who writes about Reconstruction as a splendid failure. When so much of the historical profession just dismissed the period as a mistake. And if the most famous book about it was called The Tragic Era by Clyde Bowers. Du Bois repurposes the language of tragedy. He uses it all throughout Black Reconstruction to try to give a different account of what exactly was lost. What's the promise? What's the road not taken? What's the promise lost? What's the splendid failure of Reconstruction? And how might that animate political judgment and action in the present? And it's striking, I think, to me, that even right now, you have activist groups, labor groups who are reading Black Reconstruction for inspiration. Again, to me, it goes back to the key insight about tragic theater, which is whatever defeats are on stage, there's an edification and learning process that's happening for the audience. And we have to understand that dynamic, that dialectical relation as well.
Thanks so much.
George.
So I haven't read your book yet. I'm hoping to do so soon. I thank you very much again for being with us this afternoon. It occurs to me that there's a question that I'm not sure I even know the answer to, my own answer. So I'd like to ask you, how do you define what you refer to as the civil rights movement?
It's a great question. So I take a stand with, I'm sorry, I'm having a bit of tech trouble. Here we go. I joined the historiographical movement known as the Long Civil Rights Movement. So folks like Jacqueline Dowd Hall, Nikhil Pal Singh, my mentor and advisor, Glenda Gilmore, Thomas Segru. There's an extraordinary range of scholars who have located what they consider to be the civil rights movement in the immediate post-World War I period, with the founding of some of the earliest mass civil rights organizations, the new militancy that comes out of the new Negro movement following World War I, and that sets the stage jurisprudentially, politically, and culturally for, and I should say organizationally, for the longue durée of action to contest forms of racial domination and Jim Crow segregation that consolidate in the 20th century. So for me, that long civil rights movement arc is a better way of approaching it. It gives us a better sense of all the different ideas that are on the table that people are debating in the course of making a movement. It helps us better understand the international politics, the geopolitics that even structure the classical civil rights period from 54 to 68. It helps us track the long life of ideas like the emergence of nonviolence as a philosophy and strategy into the movement, these fights over the precise jurisprudential strategies, these fights over the meaning of integration. So one of the things I recover is the early writings of A. Philip Randolph and a leftist vision of integration versus a more narrowly liberal version of integration. So for me, that longue durée story about the making of a contested, conflictual movement to fight the particular form of racial domination that consolidated from 1919 to 1960s is the right way to think about it. And the book's title, which I probably should talk more often about, is from a sermon that he gave, where the question is precisely this one: is like, if you engage in a task at which you're almost certain you'll fail, but you think it's an extraordinary task and a valuable task, is it worth it? Did you waste your life doing something like that? And of course, his answer is no, but it's an answer we need to hear again. And I thank you all for giving me the opportunity to share the work and to be pushed on some powerful questions and interrogations and to get your wisdom. I hope you stay in touch and write. I'll do my best to respond as quickly as I can.
Okay.
But it's great to meet you all.
Great.
Okay,
Thank you,
thank you.
everybody.
All right, thanks,
you.
everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you later. Bye-bye. That was Brandon Terry. His new book is titled Shattered Dreams, Infinite Hope, a tragic vision of the civil rights movement. And that's it for this edition of the Last Negroes at Harvard podcast. I'm Kent Garrett. I'll talk to you again next week.